Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a world of gold brocade and polished marble, where the air smells of beeswax candles, expensive perfume, and the faint tang of something less than fresh. You stand in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Light from hundreds of candles flickers in the gilded frames, bouncing back at you from the vast mirrors in fractured halos. You hear the rustle of silks, the clink of crystal, the faint cough of powdered courtiers trying not to draw attention. It's dazzling, intoxicating, and if you were hoping for a quiet night, you probably won't survive this one without your curiosity running wild. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where in the world are you, and what time is it there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're here for Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, the man who declared l'état, set moi and built Versailles into a shimmering monument to his glory. But if you watch closely, you'll see he never quite sits easily on those ornate, gilded chairs. That's because, in the early 1680s, the most powerful man in Europe developed a fistula, an infected tunnel in the flesh near the base of his spine. The pain was constant, sharp, and made sitting an ordeal. And in a court where sitting through endless ceremonies was part of the job, this was a royal catastrophe. The court didn't whisper about it, they obsessed over it. Remember, medicine then was equal parts performance and guesswork. Surgeons, who were still considered a tier below proper physicians, devised an experimental operation just for him. The king's fistula was so famous that nobles across Europe began requesting the same surgery, sometimes without needing it, just to prove their loyalty or trendiness. Imagine getting a scar to match your monarch's, like some bizarre 17th century fan club. Mainstream historians agreed the operation was groundbreaking. It was the first recorded successful fistula surgery of its kind, performed in 1686 by Charles Francois Felix. But there's a fringe tidbit that still circulates, that Felix spent months practicing on condemned prisoners, perfecting his technique before daring to touch the king. It's a grim image, death row doubling as a royal medical school. As you follow the Sun King down Versailles' echoing corridors, you notice his posture carefully upright, his robes adjusted to hide any wince. Historians still argue whether the fistula changed court etiquette or if the etiquette was already so rigid that the illness simply slotted in unnoticed. Either way, the king used his recovery as a political theater, letting his subjects parade through his bedchamber to see him resting, a living symbol of divine endurance. You catch a moment in the gardens, Louis standing by a fountain, sunlight catching his lace cuffs. He's smiling at a diplomat from England, but every now and then his eyes tighten, just for a second, pain carefully masked. He's learned to time his movements between spasms. You can't help thinking, in an era when rulers were symbols, not just people, the Sun King's wound became a kind of national metaphor. France was magnificent, yes, but also fragile. Beneath the gold leaf, the plaster cracked. And here you are, walking past gilded doorways into the royal chapel, knowing that every polished step of this palace hides the shuffle of a king who once ruled the known world and did it all while trying not to sit down too hard. You step out of Versailles and into the damp English morning, the air cool and smelling faintly of wet earth and roses. The gravel crunches under your shoes as you cross the gardens of Kew Palace, where King George III takes his walks. His coat is buttoned high, his wig immaculate, but his gaze has that far-off glaze of a man walking into realities at once. You've heard the stories, how he talked to trees, how he wrote endless letters without punctuation, how he once shook hands with an oak and called it Your Majesty. The truth is harder and sadder. George III's madness is now often attributed to porphyria, a rare metabolic disorder that can cause confusion, hallucinations, abdominal pain, and, in some cases, a bluish tint to the skin. The bluish hands you glimpse as he removes his gloves are more than a quirk, they're symptoms. His reign, from 1760 to 1820, should have been remembered for his reforms, his role in the agricultural revolution, and yes, losing the American colonies. Instead, the shadow of his illness clings to him like the morning mist over the Thames. A courtier approaches, offering papers to sign. George takes them with brisk precision, but then, halfway through, his hand stills. You watch his lips move. He's holding a conversation only he can hear. He nods to no one. When he snaps back, it's as if nothing happened. That's the strange thing about these episodes, they arrive like summer storms and vanish just as quickly. Here's your quirky tidbit. His doctors, believing his illness to be purely mental, often treated him by locking him in rooms, restraining him, and applying mustard poultices to his feet. Imagine being king and your treatment plan sounds like something dreamed up by a bored apothecary and a medieval torturer. Historians still argue whether Porphyria was the true cause, or if bipolar disorder might explain his wild swings from giddy energy to deep despair. In his manic states, he'd write hundreds of words without a single period, filling entire pages in one breathless sentence. You imagine his aides quietly collecting these papers, unsure whether to keep them as royal artifacts or hide them as embarrassing evidence. You walk with him through the palace's walled garden. The king gestures to the flowers, naming them in Latin. He seems, for a moment, perfectly composed, a man of science, curiosity, and warmth. Then a shift. His eyes flick to the horizon, his voice quickens, his hands begin to tremble. He speaks, faster and faster, his words colliding until they're an avalanche of sound. You realize you've crossed the invisible threshold into one of his episodes. The courtiers remain calm. They've seen it before. They keep pace with him, murmuring reassurances, subtly guiding him back toward the palace. You notice the pattern. George never quite walks in a straight line during these spells, as if the world has tilted under his feet. By evening, you're inside a small, candlelit room where the king is calmer, sipping warm milk. His breathing has slowed. His wife, Queen Charlotte, sits nearby, embroidering by the fire. They don't speak. She glances at him now and then, her expression a quiet mix of love and exhaustion. And you think, for all the public ridicule caricatures of the Mad King, whispers in Parliament, this is what it really looked like. A man carrying an illness that blurred the edges of reality, holding on to his crown with the sheer stubbornness of a monarch who refused to vanish entirely into the fog. You leave the cool English garden and step into a Madrid that smells of incense and hot dust, sunlight flashing off tiled roofs as if the whole city were a brazier. Inside the Alcazar, rooms unfold like jewel boxes, brocade walls, thick carpets, portraits that stare with the same long, drooping Habsburg lips. You've met royal pain before, the Sun King's sword that made sitting an art form, George's mind that sometimes outran the horizon, but here you face a dynasty's story written onto a single face. Charles II of Spain waits behind a curtain of velvet, the last male of a line braided too tightly with itself. When he emerges, you feel the hush that always follows him, the way people hold their breath out of courtesy and worrying. His jaw prognathous, heavy, misaligned, tilts the whole geometry of his features. It isn't a caricature. It's a weight, pulling speech sideways, tugging breath into snags. He tries to smile and you see the effort cost him. Charles moves carefully, like a man who's learned that every step can betray a weakness, and you realize how many rooms in Europe are arranged around what kings cannot do. Mainstream history doesn't mince words. The Habsburg jaw wasn't just a quirk. It was the visible emblem of generations of consanguineous marriages among Europe's most powerful house. Charles II was born in 1661, crowned as a child, and reigned until 1700, presiding, if that is the right verb, over an empire stretched thin by debt, war, and administration done by those who spoke louder than he could. You trail him through the palace chapel as he kneels longer than comfort suggests, perhaps because prayer is the one place nobody expects him to answer quickly. The court compensates with pageantry, trumpets, gold thread uniforms, an avalanche of protocol that feels like Versailles with the windows shut. You remember George's doctors and their mustard poultices, and you half expect a Spanish apothecary to suggest something equally imaginative, maybe a rosary soaked in rosemary to strengthen the humors. Instead, the treatments are mostly tonics, pilgrimages, and the quiet bargaining of courtiers who hope a miracle might also secure their pensions. Here's your quirky sidelight. Some accounts insist that when Charles was an infant he was not allowed to be bathed frequently because of fears he would catch wine through the skin, an echo of pre-modern medical ideas about pores and spirits, and that caretakers sometimes fed him a broth of deer antler powder to spur vigor. You can imagine the nursery, priests, nurses, and a rotating cast of worried nobles peering into a cradle like astronomers hoping the stars will rearrange themselves into better omens. You walk with Charles into a council chamber where maps sprawl across the table, America's, Italy, the Low Countries, lines that look firm until you notice the ink has faded at the edges. He listens as ministers argue, Too many fronts, too few coins, ships that never return. He nods, presses his lips as if to pin words in place, and finally speaks, slow and thick, a phrase at a time. The room leans forward, patient. This is how policy moves here in careful inches, not strides. Historians still argue whether Charles's limitations were primarily the product of severe mandibular deformity and endocrine problems. Thyroid dysfunction is often mentioned, or whether childhood illness and developmental delays from genetic load amplified everything until routine tasks were mountains. The papers say he was of good intention, which is a kind way to describe someone whose gentleness couldn't fend off wolves. Good intentions don't balance ledgers or load cannon. You see him later with his first wife, Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who gamely tries to paint color onto the grayness of court. They walk a garden path bordered by orange trees. She laughs at something, a small, bright sound, and for a moment the air softens. But the pressure of an heir sits at the table, on the bed, inside every glance. When she dies young, the palace carpets swallow the sound of grief, as carpets are built to do. His second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg arrives with hope pre-packed by diplomats, and again the hope spoils in the heat. No children come. Courtiers count months the way gamblers count cards. You can't help but light aside. We're royal family. Trees, the first closed beta tests in European history. Limited participants, excessive feedback loops, and, unfortunately, lots of bugs. Yes, you smile. No, you don't say it aloud in the council chamber. A second little joke slips in as you pass the stable. Someone has hung a charm of braided garlic to protect the horses from the evil eye. And you think, finally, a medical intervention with flavor. And one more, to keep the balance. The court astrologer consults charts so often that you suspect he's less concerned with the stars and more with how often he can invoice for urgent celestial updates. Back in the chapel, candles gutter. In the draft, Charles watches a mass said for Spain's deliverance, his eyes shiny with the kind of faith that is partly piety and partly strategy. If God is on your side, perhaps creditors will be gentler. His confessor murmurs counsel, his ministers scheme. Ambassadors send home letters written in the delicate script of men who know a throne may soon be empty. The king's body has become statecraft, his jaw a metaphor engraved into policy. The rumor mills grind. Foreign princes weigh claims like chefs testing sauce. You think about the shape of power when it's carried in a body that resists it. Louis's pain made court a theater of endurance. George's episodes made governance a dance between clarity and fog. Charles turns rulership into a study of patience, the empire's momentum held together by ritual, tradition, and the inertia of maps printed in better years. This is how a hidden illness ruins a life without fireworks, slowly, collectively, forcing everyone nearby to become an accessory to tragedy. A final audience. The king signs a paper, hands shaking, the seal pressed too hard so wax spills down like red tears. He looks at you, or through you, and for a moment you want to tell him that he is not just the end of a line. He is a young boy who learned to live inside a hall of whispers and did not entirely disappear. When he dies in 1700, the War of the Spanish Succession ignites almost at once, proof that while one man's jaw can hold back words, it cannot hold back Europe. As you exit into the Madrid twilight, church bells lift on warm air. Somewhere, a baker laughs, a child chases a street dog, and the empire, already fraying, still tastes of cinnamon and silver. You step away knowing that sometimes a dynasty doesn't fall like a tower. It slumps, quietly, like a face that cannot quite close. The Madrid twilight gives way to a soft gray drizzle over the Scottish Highlands, and then, as if the landscape itself sighs, you find yourself on the gravel path leading to Balmoral Castle. The granite walls stand solid against the wind, their edges softened by ivy, and the smell of wet pine needles mixes with the faint smoke of a hearth inside. A footman nods you through to a private drawing room. Queen Victoria sits by the fire, her black dress absorbing the light, hands moving rhythmically over an embroidery hoop. The stitches are neat, precise, something to keep the hands busy when the mind is elsewhere. In public, she is the matriarch of Empire, stoic, upright, the grandmother of Europe. But in this quiet room, away from the glittering ceremonies, you feel the weight of something private, a melancholy that has shadowed her for decades. The death of Prince Albert in 1861 is the obvious wound, but those who knew her well noticed that even before his death, There were spells when her energy drained away, her gaze dimmed, and her letters took on an almost confessional tone. Mainstream history will tell you she withdrew from public life for years after Albert's death, appearing only when absolutely necessary, which fed Republican murmurs and newspaper cartoons of the Invisible Queen. But there's a fringe thread of speculation, whispered among certain biographers, that she may have suffered from recurrent depressive episodes long before her famous seclusion episodes masked by the formal duties and tightly choreographed schedule of royal life. You catch a glance from her as the clock chimes. She doesn't smile, but there's a softness there, as if she knows you've seen through the veil. She turns back to her embroidery, the thread gliding through cloth in the slow rhythm of someone pacing a restless mind. The room is warm, but the air feels heavy, almost as if her mood colors it. Your quirky tidbit comes from one of her journals. On some mornings she would order the blinds drawn and candles lit, even in full daylight, creating a cocoon of darkness in which she could write undisturbed. She called these retreat mornings, and while her staff treated them as eccentricity, you can imagine how they might have been an attempt to control the emotional climate of the day. Historians still argue whether her melancholy was clinical depression, a form of seasonal affective disorder exacerbated by the long Scottish winters, or simply the natural ebb of energy in a life burdened by constant public scrutiny. In her letters to her eldest daughter, she alternates between bursts of enthusiasm over political affairs and long passages of introspection that sound like someone trying to keep the walls from closing in. A maid enters with tea, setting the tray down without a word. Victoria stirs it absent-mindedly, the spoon circling 3, 4, 5 times before she notices it hasn't touched her lips. She finally sips, then looks toward the rain-speckled window. Albert loved this weather, she says, almost to herself. The fire pops in the grate. You realize she has filled her life with people, children, servants, ministers, but still carries an emptiness that no state banquet can fill. Out in the Balmoral grounds, the rain has eased to a mist. You walk under ancient Scots pines, there, trunks black with damp, and you remember the popular image of Victoria, small in stature, but vast in symbolic weight. In the villages, her profile appears on coins, medals, commemorative plates, yet here, within the thick castle walls, she is simply a widow who learned to carry grief like another layer of clothing. You can't help but light aside as you pass the castle's kitchens. The smell of scones wafts out, and you think, if therapy were a thing here, half the empire's GDP in shortbread could have been saved. Then, in the stables, you see her pony, an old, gentle creature she sometimes rides despite her staff's fretting. A monarch on horseback, you think, but, in this case, the horse is doing most of the monarchy. And for your third small joke, you remember that she once had a servant dress as a Highland gillie just to stand outside her window and blow a hunting horn in the mornings. Not exactly a wellness routine, but certainly memorable. Back inside, the Queen reviews a dispatch from London. Her brow furrows. She writes a note in the margin before handing it back. Her handwriting is tight, the letters slanting forward, as though pulled by a gravity no one else can see. The minister bows, retreating. Without a word. As evening deepens, she sits again by the fire, the embroidery hoop resting in her lap. The castle clock chimes. Somewhere down the hall, a piano plays a slow, minor waltz. Victoria closes her eyes, not in sleep, but in that suspended place where the body rests and the mind drifts. You feel the quiet settle around her, and it's the kind of quiet that isn't just absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. Walking away through the castle corridor, you glance back once. She hasn't moved. Outside, the Highland wind rises, rattling the windows, but inside, the Queen's world is steady, measured, and contained, a fortress not only of stone, but of habit, ritual, and the determination to keep grief politely seated at the table without letting it speak too loudly. You leave the cool stone of Balmoral behind and step straight into a heat that presses against your skin like a damp cloth. The sun of ancient Egypt is merciless, bleaching the sand until it glows white, making the air above it shimmer. In the distance, the Nile gleams narrow, winding, a ribbon of life against a desert that seems to stretch forever. You follow a column of priests and servants through the courtyard of a temple, where lotus-shaped columns cast long, cool shadows. At the center of this procession, shaded by an ornate canopy, is Tutankhamun, the boy pharaoh whose serene face, in gold, has stared from museum posters and history books for a century. from a distance, he is the image of perfection, straight-backed, graceful, the embodiment of divine kingship. But the closer you walk, the more you notice the slight unevenness in his gait. The way he favors one leg, as if a misstep could send pain shooting upward. Beneath the linen kilt, the leg is wrapped to support a clubfoot, a condition likely present from birth. The sandals you see in his tomb thousands of years later will have one sole slightly higher than the other, a quiet detail overlooked by most tourists. Mainstream archaeology confirms Tutankhamun's physical ailments went beyond the foot. CT scans of his mummy have revealed a cleft palate, curved spine, and signs of malaria infection. These are the truths hidden behind the image of a god king. Yet among Egyptologists, there is still debate were these ailments the result of inbreeding among the royal family, or simply the misfortunes of an individual life in a harsh climate. You walk beside him as he ascends the temple steps. The climb is slow. His attendants keep their eyes averted, partly out of respect, partly to avoid betraying pity. Each step is measured, a tiny battle between the image of a ruler and the reality of a young man's body. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some scholars believe that Tutankhamun may have used ceremonial walking sticks not only as symbols of authority, but because he actually needed them to get around. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, far more than a healthy young man would require. Some are lavishly inlaid with ivory and gold, but others are worn at the handle, their wood polished by years of use. In the temple's cool interior, incense coils upward into the gloom. You stand beside him as he offers libations to Amun-Ra, the god whose name was restored under his reign after his father Akhenaten's religious revolution. The priests chant. The air is thick with myrrh and frankincense. Tutankhamun's expression is composed, but you notice the subtle shifting of his weight from one foot to the other. Historians still argue whether his early death around age 18 or 19 was caused by illness, injury, or both. Some point to a fractured leg bone found in his mummy, theorizing an infection that spiraled out of control. Others suggest his fragile health meant even a minor fall could have been fatal in a land where medicine was a mix of herbs, prayers, and amulets. Stepping out into the blinding light again, you follow him toward the royal gardens. Date palms sway in the faint breeze. An ibis stalks the edge of a pond, spearing fish with mechanical precision. You imagine the young pharaoh resting here, listening to the water and pretending, for a moment, that his body was as perfect as the statues made in his likeness. And, because every court, ancient or modern, has its moments of absurdity, you catch three small flashes of humor. First, a pair of bored guards playing a silent game of how long can I balance my spear upright while pretending to watch the crowd. Second, an overfed temple cat sprawled across a sacred altar, blissfully unaware that it's technically part of the ceremony now. And third, an artisan squinting at a half-finished statue of the king, muttering, "No, no, make the legs longer, nobody needs to know." The day cools slightly as the sun tips toward the horizon. Tutankhamun is led back into the palace, a place of painted walls, cedarwood scent, and the sound of distant musicians. In his private chambers, he removes the ceremonial crown, setting it down with the care of someone who knows its weight isn't just gold, it's expectation. You can almost hear the relief in his breath as he lowers himself onto cushions, the stiffness in his leg easing for the first time all day. You leave him there, bathed in the last golden light, a god in the eyes of his people, but, in truth, a young man living in a body that was never built for the weight of a throne. The desert heat fades, replaced by the icy draft of a St. Petersburg winter. Your breath hangs in the air as you step into the marble corridors of the Alexander Palace. The walls are lined with oil paintings of stern ancestors in gilded frames, each one watching as if to remind you that the Romanovs are more than flesh, they are a dynasty, eternal in name if not in health. You follow the sound of laughter, high and thin, echoing from a drawing room where toys are scattered across the carpet. At the center is a pale, delicate boy with bright eyes, Alexei Nikolaevich, heir to the Russian throne. From across the room, you see the boy leap forward to greet you, but his mother, Alexandra, reaches out instinctively, catching him by the arm. Her fingers tighten, and you notice why just that quick movement has left a faint bloom of red beneath his skin. Alexei has hemophilia, a genetic disorder that prevents his blood from clotting properly. In a palace where every step of a prince is choreographed for effect. His steps are measured for survival. Mainstream history tells you hemophilia entered the royal bloodlines through Queen Victoria, whose descendants spread it to several European houses. For Alexei, the diagnosis was a death sentence hiding in plain sight. A bruise could be dangerous, a fall could be fatal. You've heard the stories of him confined to bed for weeks, his joints swollen and hot from internal bleeding. His illness was the Romanovs' most guarded secret, concealed from the public to protect the monarchy's image of divine invincibility. Your quirky tidbit: the palace staff were trained in a silent protocol for emergencies. If Alexei was injured, the nearest servant would discreetly remove breakable objects, curtains would be drawn, and a small group of trusted doctors summoned. The rest of the household was told only that the heir is resting, a phrase that could mean anything from he's napping to he's at death's door. Historians still argue whether Rasputin the mystic who gained the family's trust actually helped Alexei's condition, or simply offered comfort during attacks. Some point out that Rasputin advised against certain medications that might have worsened bleeding, while others claim his influence was more psychological than medical. You watch Alexei sit on a thick cushion by the window, staring out at the snow. He's restless, his hands twist a wooden toy soldier, his feet tapping softly. Across the room, Nicholas II, the Tsar himself, reads a newspaper but keeps one eye on his son. It's a strange inversion of power, the ruler of a vast empire watching, the boy who could bring that empire to its knees not through politics or war, but through the fragility of his veins. You catch three small moments that almost make you smile. First, Alexei's spaniel, Joy, clambering onto his lap and refusing to move until bribed with a biscuit. Second, his sister Anastasia sneaking behind him to tie a ribbon in his hair before darting away, giggling. And third, the boy himself sticking his tongue out at a particularly pompous portrait of his grandfather. Even heirs have their rebellions. Light snow begins to fall outside, flakes melting as they hit the window. Alexei shifts his weight, wincing, and you see Alexandra's face tighten. She rises, takes his hand, and leads him toward a private sitting room. Inside, the air is warmer, thick with the scent of chamomile tea. She settles him on a sofa, tucking a wool blanket around his legs, humming a lullaby so low it's almost swallowed by the fire's crackle. This is the hidden world behind imperial portraits, not balls, not parades, but a mother counting every movement, a father holding his breath each time his son plays, a court trained to smile while listening for a cry of pain. Alexei leans back, the tension draining from his small frame, and you realize that for him, safety is never the absence of danger, only the skill of keeping it at bay. You leave the palace through a side door, stepping into the hush of the snowy gardens. Somewhere far off, a sleigh bell jingles. The air remains inside, cocooned in warmth, the empire outside swirling with unrest. And you can't help but think, sometimes the fate of a nation rests not on the battlefield, but on the skin of a child so thin it bruises like fruit. The snow dissolves into the brisk, damp air of a Prussian morning. The sun hasn't fully risen over the spires of Potsdam, and the gravel paths of Sanssouci Palace glisten from a night's drizzle. You follow the sound of footsteps echoing through a marble corridor and find Frederick II of Prussia, Frederick the Great, seated at a long table. Maps are spread before him, lines inked in red and blue, tiny figurines marking regiments. A breakfast tray sits to one side, largely untouched except for a half-eaten crust of bread and a cup of bitter coffee. At first glance, he's every inch the military genius, sharp features, powdered hair tied neatly, eyes bright with calculation. But then you notice the way his hand lingers on his abdomen, pressing just so, as if trying to ease a knot deep inside. Frederick suffered from chronic digestive troubles, likely irritable bowel disease or a severe ulcer that shadowed his life like an uninvited aide-de-camp. Mainstream history remembers him as the architect of Prussia's military rise in the 18th century, but rarely pauses to note how often he conducted affairs of state while doubled over in discomfort. Some of his letters mention days lost to violent colics and grievous stomach pains. Even in victory, the man was negotiating both enemies and his own insides. Your quirky tidbit: Frederick was famously fond of simple food, bread, beer, and pickled herring, but his condition often meant he couldn't enjoy even these without consequence. One aide recorded an instance where a lavish banquet had to be abruptly halted because the king departed in haste, clutching his side. The musicians kept playing, the guests kept eating, and the court pretended nothing was amiss. Historians still argue whether his illness was stress-induced, exacerbated by decades of military campaigns, or hereditary. Some note that his famously austere diet was meant to control symptoms, while others think it may have worsened them. In either case, Frederick managed his discomfort the way he managed his army, by maintaining discipline and pretending weakness didn't exist. You watch as he moves pieces on the map, his long fingers tracing the rivers of Bohemia, the hills of Saxony. A cough seizes him, dry, short, the kind that steals breath but leaves dignity intact. He reaches for his coffee, sips, and continues as if nothing happened. The officers around him don't flinch. They've seen this dance before. There's room for humor even here. First, a hound sprawled under the war table, snoring through the fate of Europe. Second, an aide balancing to stacks of documents so high you suspect he can't actually see where he's going. And third, a miniature portrait of Voltaire on the wall, Frederick's old pen pal and frenemy, hung at a slightly crooked angle, as if the king can't decide whether to straighten it or let it mock him. Later in the day, you follow Frederick to the gardens of Sanssouci. The morning fog clings to the terraces of grapevines, their leaves damp and curling. He walks slowly, pausing to greet gardeners by name, his cane tapping rhythmically against the stones. The air is crisp, and for a brief moment, the strain in his face eases. Inside again, he sits in a small music room and lifts a flute. His fingers settle on the keys with practiced grace, and the first notes drift out, light and clean. Here, you think, is the other Frederick, the one who composes concertos in the quiet hours, when strategy and stomach both rest. But midway through a sonata, his hand drops. The pain has returned, and his eyes close for a moment, the music dissolving into the stillness. He resumes a few bars later, as if nothing had interrupted him. And you realize that this has been his life, interruptions that must be ignored, battles fought in silence. It's a strange kind of warfare against an enemy you can't outflank, can't intimidate, can't defeat, only endure. As the day wanes, Frederick leans over a final map. The candles cast shadows that make the rivers look like veins, the borders like scars. Outside, the fog thickens again, wrapping the palace in pale gray. He stands, adjusts his coat, and walks away without a backward glance, leaving the war, both political and physical, waiting for him tomorrow. The fog of Potsdam thins into London drizzle, and you duck beneath a dripping eave as a carriage lumbers to a stop outside St. James's Palace. The horses snort steam, footmen jump down. And then comes the slow choreography of getting a monarch. Indoors, you watch as two attendants unfold a sturdy chair, half sedan, half throne, and lift Queen Anne with practiced care. The motion is gentle, almost reverent, as if they're carrying a chandelier that can glare back. Her face is pale, composed, and if you look closely, modeled at the hands and ankles by the telltale purple-brown stains of gout and edema, the body's quiet, bruised complaint. Inside, the corridor smells of wax, wet wool, and chocolatans. Favorite comfort, rich and fortifying. She nods to the guard, then to you, and you follow her into a room bright with coal fire and political weather. The queen settles into a high-backed chair. A footstool appears, another cushion follows. A third cushion, because the first to never quite get it right, is tucked in by a lady of the bedchamber. Court life is an inventory of small adjustments, mainstream. History puts dates on the walls like pictures, and reigns from 1702 to 1714. The War of the Spanish Succession thunders abroad. And, most lastingly, the Acts of Union in 1707 weld England and Scotland into Great Britain. But history also lives in bone and blood. Anne's gout, often described in her letters as the rheumatism, swells joints until walking is a negotiation. Dropsy fluid retention turns ankles to ache and skin to plum shades that silk sleeves cannot hide. In later years she uses wheeled chairs indoors, sedan chairs outdoors, and the measured courtesy of servants whose job is to anticipate pain before it speaks. You stand beside the window where rain feathers the glass. Ministers enter, bow, discuss fleets and subsidies. The queen listens carefully, hands resting on the chair arms, rings glinting on fingers puffed at the knuckles. A dispatch mentions Marlborough. The name draws a flicker across her face. Sarah Churchill, Anne's longtime friend turned complicated adversary, haunts these rooms even when absent. Historians still argue whether policy here is truly Anne's or whether Sarah's influence, Then Abigail Massams steers the rudder while the monarch holds the tiller for show. You notice that when arguments sharpen, and some rubs, a single ring habit, pain, or both channeled into a steadying ritual, your quirky tidbit drifts in with the chocolate tray. Satirists of the day nicknamed her Brandy Non, swearing she favored a bracer of spirits with her cups. It's probably exaggerated. Satirists rarely let truth spoil a joke, but servants did note she took thick, sweet hot chocolate at odd hours, a small empire of comfort in a porcelain cup. Another detail, at Bath, where she seeks relief in the mineral waters, the city obligingly reorients its scheduled church bells, promenades, even gossip to her swollen timetable. Imagine a spa town adjusting its gossip window because the Queen's ankles require an extra half hour, she gestures, and a map is unfurled across a low table. Leaning forward is an effort. You see it in the breath she takes, the wince she hides with a blink. That fort, she says, voice low, must hold. A clerk bends and moves a pin. You think of Frederick's maps and Louis's bedchamber audiences, how illness turns governance into theatering around. Here, the choreography is cushions, warming pans, and footmen learning to walk at a sovereign's slower pace without making slowness look like defeat. 3 light glimmers to keep the air from getting too heavy. First, a spaniel dozing by the hearth, claiming a royal slipper as a pillow and snoring with insubordinate gusto. Second, a very serious lord misplaces his peruke on the back of a chair. When he bows, it stays behind like a molting bird, and no one breathes a word. Third, a new footstool arrives with such ceremony that you're tempted to ask if it has a title. Baron of arch support, perhaps, when the ministers withdraw, and allows herself the luxury of a sigh. A lady brings a shawl. Another helps shift her legs a fraction. Even that fraction is measured in pain. The Queen asks for a letter, the one from a Scottish minister worrying that union will break rather than bind. She reads, nods, and dictates. A reply firm enough to steady a wobbly century. Great Britain is the future. The crown's body may bruise, but the state's body must not. If you listen closely, you hear how illness deepens her voice, rounds it with empathy. She knows, more intimately than most sovereigns, what endurance feels like at the joint. In private, she speaks of children. 17 pregnancies, and yet no surviving heir. Of all those brief lives, only Prince William reached boyhood, and he, too, died young. The silence after that sentence is not ceremonial. It is the quiet of a house that learned to fold away small clothes too many times. You grasp how easily satire, which is history's laugh track, can miss the ache that underpins a reign. If her body was a battlefield, the losses were not only in the ankles. Rain lifts, the sky turns pewter. The Queen's physicians step in wigs, solemn faces, the faint scent of herbs and misplaced confidence. They recommend more waters, less meat, gentle movement, patience, and a poultice that smells suspiciously like a kitchen experiment gone wrong. You think of George's mustard foot wraps and the Sun King's customized scalpel, remember the mustard poultices, and wonder if early modern medicine's true genius isn't cure but creativity. Historians still argue whether Anne's gout sprang chiefly from genetics and metabolic disorder or from the era's diet, rich sauces, sugared drinks, and the kind of healthy advice that would horrify a modern clinic. The debate never quite ends, which is its own kind of diagnosis. Uncertainty, chronic and recurrent. Evening draws a velvet line along the window. Candles are lit, the flame shivers when someone passes too quickly. A court musician plays a gentle air notes that tiptoe, as if not to jostle the royal joints, and closes her eyes, listening. Pain doesn't retreat. It merely quiets enough to let the melody through. When she speaks again, her voice is tender and practical at once. Letters to sign, a chapel service to schedule, a word to be sent to. Bath about the baths, the monarchy is work, even when the worker cannot stand unaided. You leave the room with the last of the ministers, aware that the Queen will not sleep easily. The palace corridor is a tunnel of portraits, faces flicker in candlelight, their pigments warmed by the fire's breath. Behind you, somewhere, a cushion is adjusted again, a shawl is lifted, a cup is refilled. Ahead lies a country newly unified, armies abroad, pamphlets sharpening their teeth. And at the center, a woman in pain who keeps the chair steady, the map unfolded, the crown balanced not on the head, but on the will. The damp streets of London dissolve into warm, salt-scented air. You find yourself in the gardens of the Palacio das Necessidades in Lisbon, sunlight flickering through orange trees. Somewhere a fountain murmurs, beyond the gates, the Tagus River glints under a sky so blue it almost looks painted. Dom Pedro V, King of Portugal, strolls along the gravel path ahead of you, his frame tall but slender to the point of fragility. He stops now and then to catch his breath, glancing toward the open water as though it holds some promise he's been chasing his whole life. Tuberculosis, known here simply as consumption, has taken hold of him. Mainstream history notes that Pedro reigned only from 1853 to 1861, dying at the age of 24. To his subjects, he was the hopeful king, modern-minded and reformist, opening hospitals, pushing for railways, and embracing public health measures decades before they were fashionable. But beneath the optimism was a body at war with itself. You walk beside him along a shaded pergola. The air smells faintly of jasmine, but his breathing is shallow, labored in the still heat. Every so often, he pauses, leaning on the cane that court painters discreetly omit. Historians still argue whether he contracted TB during a state visit abroad or from the miasma of the crowded Lisbon slums he worked to improve. Either way, the irony isn't lost. His efforts to modernize public health couldn't save his own. Here's your quirky tidbit. In his private chambers, Pedro kept a wide collection of barometers and thermometers, obsessively noting the weather each day in the belief that the right air might hold the key to recovery. When the fog rolled in from the Atlantic, he'd order the windows thrown wide, pacing the room to inhale strength. On clear mornings, he'd take breakfast outside, wrapped in blankets, convinced the sun itself was medicinal. Today, the sky is flawless. You follow him to a bench overlooking the gardens, where he sits and watches gardeners prune rose bushes. He asks, almost idly, about the state of the schools in the provinces. A minister answers, careful to keep his voice light, as though the king's breathlessness is just the heat playing tricks. You notice the care with which the minister turns each reply into a kind of encouragement, subtle diplomacy for a monarch who may not see the long-term fruits of his own policies. Your three small flashes of humor come easily here. First, a gardener's cat has decided the king's lap is the best place to nap, and Pedro allows it, stroking absent-mindedly as if it were a constitutional duty. Second, a courtier trailing behind manages to trip over the same route twice, blaming both incidents on shadows. And third, a pair of palace pigeons appear to be conducting their own diplomatic conference on the roof, complete with vigorous nodding and occasional wing flaps for emphasis. As the afternoon stretches on, Pedro stands and makes his way toward the riverside terrace. The light here is different, sharper, more open. He closes his eyes, breathing in deeply, as if the salt in the air might scour the illness from his lungs. A cough interrupts the moment, bending him forward. A handkerchief appears instantly in his hand. You catch a glimpse of what he hides in the folds and quickly look away. Back inside the palace, the corridors are cool and dim. He stops to examine a new map of the railway project, lines like veins threading through Portugal's heart. This, he says, tracing a route toward Porto, will outlast me. The matter-of-fact tone leaves no space for protest. The courtiers nod. You can feel in the air that everyone here knows they are running out of time, yet they proceed as if the horizon isn't moving toward them quite so fast. Historians still debate whether his reforms, progressive for their day, were fully his vision or the work of his ministers carried forward under his name. But even his critics admit he embodied a rare combination of curiosity and gentleness. Illness didn't harden him into detachment. It seemed to make him more attuned to the lives of ordinary people who, like him, measured days in breaths and weather. The sun lowers toward the west, gilding the river in molten gold. Pedro pauses by a window, leaning lightly against the frame, and smiles at something unseen, perhaps the breeze, perhaps the fact that for one more evening, the air feels light enough to fill his lungs without effort. You leave him there, silhouetted against the light, a young king chasing the kind of breath that can never be stored, only borrowed. The warm glow of the Tagus fades, and you find yourself in the echoing marble corridors of the Vatican. The scent here is old stone, beeswax, and faint incense, a blend that seems to settle into your clothes as soon as you enter. The papal apartments are quieter than you expect. No murmuring tourists, no cardinals bustling with files, just the sound of a clock ticking somewhere behind a gilded door. You step into a chamber where Pope Innocent VIII sits beneath a heavy canopy, his robe a waterfall of white silk trimmed with gold. From a distance, he looks regal, composed, but as you move closer, you notice the subtle shifts in his position, the way he rests his hands on the arm of the chair and adjusts his weight every few minutes. His eyes are slightly sunken, his skin sallow, signs of a body waging a slow, quiet war with its own kidneys. In an age when medical knowledge is more alchemy than science, kidney failure is not just a sentence, it's a drawn-out negotiation between pain, swelling, and fatigue. Mainstream history remembers Innocent VIII for his political entanglements, the launching of crusades against the Ottoman Turks, and the papal bull Summis Desiderentes Effectibus, which essentially legitimized witch hunts in Europe. But those same years saw him physically diminished, his energy ebbing even as he was called upon to arbitrate matters between kings. Your quirky tidbit: one of the stranger cures attempted involved transfusing the blood of 3 young boys into the Pope in the hope of reviving him. Not only did it fail, but all 3 donors died, turning an act meant to extend life into a small, tragic footnote in the history of medicine. It was an early, disastrous experiment in transfusion, centuries before the concept of blood types was understood. Historians still argue whether his declining health directly influenced the Vatican's politics or simply slowed the machinery of decision-making. Some suggest the urgency in certain diplomatic moves came from the Pope's awareness of his limited time, while others think it was more a case of his secretaries working overtime to cover for his absences. You watch as a messenger kneels before him, presenting a sealed letter. Innocent breaks the wax with a hand that trembles slightly, scanning the words with narrowed eyes. When he speaks, it's in a measured, almost breathless cadence, as if each sentence is a small climb. He gives instructions, and you can tell they are well practiced. Brevity is his ally now. A court physician hovers nearby, carrying a pouch of dried herbs that smell faintly of juniper and rosemary. He recommends more rest, lighter meals, and infusions to purify the humors. The Pope nods but waves him off. The affairs of Christendom will not wait for a nap. Your 3 small glimmers of humor appear in unexpected corners. First, a young Swiss guard standing so still at his post that you catch him blinking in perfect rhythm with the clock, possibly to stay awake. Second, a secretary shuffling papers with such exaggerated care that a single page takes the length of a psalm to turn. And third, a small Vatican cat darting into the chamber, ignoring centuries of protocol to curl up on the Pope's silk train, which no one dares move. In the late afternoon, Innocent moves to a window overlooking the Cortile del Belvedere. The winter light turns the marble pale blue, and he seems, for a moment, far from the worries of state. He speaks softly to an aide about the gardens, the way the lemon trees struggled this year, the taste of the first figs in summer. These are the things that keep a man tethered when the machinery of power feels too heavy. When the audience ends, you walk through the Vatican halls, passing frescoes of triumph and martyrdom. Behind you, the Pope remains in his chair, eyes closed, not asleep, but listening to the faint choir practicing in the chapel below. His breathing is slow, deliberate, as if he's rationing his strength for the next petition, the next treaty, the next day he will spend in the service of a church that expects eternity from men who have only so many heartbeats left. From the Vatican's cool marble you step into Punjab sunlight so bright it feels freshly minted. Peacocks screech somewhere beyond a screen of cypresses. Ahead, a facade rises that could be a Paris daydream. Columns, pediments, a balustrade, punctuated by urns, yet the dust, the scent of neem, the sing-song of Punjabi from the servants anchor you in Caprathala. This is Jagatjit Palace, the Versailles of Punjab, dreamed up by a Francophile ruler who collected Europe the way other men collect stamps. Built in the first decade of the 1900s and modeled on Versailles and Fontainebleau. It is stage and mask all at once, a place where a king can hide in splendor while the body keeps its own more stubborn schedule. kapurthala.gov.in +1 India CINE hub.gov.nu. Follow the Maharaja himself, Jagatjit Singh, down a gallery where painted ceilings glow with allegories in powdered blues and buttery golds. He moves with the unhurried grace of a man who knows rooms will wait for him. The walking stick in his hand clicks gently on the polished floor. A valet keeps half a step close, eyes flicking for the smallest falter. Court gossip prefers stories about the Maharaja's Parisian tailors and his taste for French clocks and chandeliers. The servants who notice breathing and swelling and the way fatigue settles behind the eyes by late afternoon. Keep it different. Ledger. There's talk of the Maharaja's heart, no diagnosis, just the house word for those episodes when he pauses, hand lightly to his chest, and asks that the car be brought round instead of the carriage. Whether it is angina, lingering effects of pneumonia in later years, or simply the ache of age in a life lived at ceremonial speed, nobody agrees. Historians still argue whether declining health shaped his schedule or whether the schedule conveniently disguised it. You're beginning to recognize a pattern. Remember Louis' staged recovery audiences and Anne's cushion choreography. For the boldness of the facades, this is a house trained to look away kindly. Travels of Samwise mainstream. Fact first. Jagajit Singh was the last ruling Maharaja of Kapurthala, assuming full powers in 1890 and reigning until Indian independence. He loved France with a collector's intensity, built French-inspired palaces, and even christened a reception hall for Louis XIV. He represented India at the League of Nations more than once in the 1920s, proof that he was not just drapes and dinners, but also diplomacy and debate. Wikipedia India CINEHub.gov.in Chief send your quirky tidbit. In 1908 he married Anita Delgado, a teenage flamenco dancer from Malaga whom he'd first seen performing in Spain. She became Rani Prem Kaur, a Spanish rose transplanted into a Punjabi hothouse, which sounds like a novel because, for a few years, it was. Court painters adjusted the palette accordingly. Wikipedia filter world the esoteric curios a.blogspot.com you trail the Maharaja into the Durbar Hall where, even empty, the space hums with remembered ceremony. A steward steps forward with a silver tray of letters from Calcutta, Geneva, and Delhi. He reads standing, then sits slowly, as though easing himself into an arrangement agreed upon by back, breath, and pride. The tiniest exhale gives him away. He signs briskly, but after 3 letters he rests the pen and rubs at the heel of his hand, a gesture you've already seen on ministers twice his age. Outside, a car coughs to life. He once loved fast drives under Punjab's winter sun, scarf flying, lunettes on. Today he asks for the shaded side of the veranda and 20 minutes of quiet before audiences resume. 3 light glimmers of humor bob up even in the stillness. First, a palace gardener doing battle with the bougainvillea has enlisted a second gardener, 2 ladders, and a sermon. The vine looks unconvinced. Second, a French ormolu clock one of many chimes 6 different times between noon and 2, each insisting it alone is right very League of Nations. Third, a young courtier, eager to impress, tries to pronounce Fontainebleau, gets lost somewhere after font, and confidently lands on Fontainebleau, which, to be fair, does sound refreshing. In the late morning, the Maharaja receives a delegation from a local school. He stands to greet the children, jaw set against the hint of breathlessness that follows longer sentences. His voice, when he speaks to them about study and curiosity, is rich, trained by decades of speeches, warmed by a polyglot's delight. He chats to one boy in French, to another in English, and to a shy girl in Punjabi so soft you barely catch it. The children beam, the teachers bow, the valet keeps watch at the edge of the carpet with the kind of attention that earns no medals. Wikipedia in a quieter room afterward, a physician murmurs about routine lighter meals, a tonic, a stroll in the cooler hour. You think of George III's mustard poultices, of the Sun King's bespoke scalpel. Modernity has improved bedside manners, if not omniscience. The doctor suggests more time at the hill station, where the air tastes of pine and rain. The Maharaja nods, eyes wandering to a portrait of Anita from the first bright year's lace, feathers, that brave, angular smile of a girl who crossed continents and etiquette. The marriage, like many fairy tales that involve real rent and real relatives, did not last, but the palace kept the picture, perhaps because stories prefer beginnings. Wikipedia History and Women.com by afternoon, the palace empties into shade. A secretary lays out papers for a journey to Delhi, another brings a clipped note from an old friend in London who remembers dinners at Claridge's and wonders if the Paris of Punjab still holds its shine. It does. But you notice how carefully the day is braided now. 30 minutes work, 15 minutes rest, a glass of water, a measured walk along the loggia where shadows stripe the floor like a piano. When the breath shortens, the stick takes a quicker beat. When it steadies, he pauses to admire the lemon trees. Historians still argue whether later life ailments, call them cardiac, respiratory, or simply cumulative, ever touched affairs of state, or whether his secretariat quietly padded the calendar the way a lady-in-waiting pads a footstool. You suspect both can be true at once. Toward dusk, a car delivers news from Delhi. Independence has remade everyone's furniture. Princely states fold into unions. Old titles go on display in new ways. Jagdich's signature helped guide Kapurthala into the post-1947 arrangement. The room where he signs now smells faintly of ink and mothballs, endings and upkeep. A cough takes him mid-sentence. He waits it out and finishes. The pen scratches like a cricket in the corner. Wikipedia drift back into the long gallery one. Last time. The ceiling allegories are all serenity, justice blindfolded, abundance spilling fruit, victory faintly bored. Outside, dusk thickens to a violet you could spread on toast. The palace orchestra, reduced now to a harmonium and a hopeful violin, rehearses a waltz. The rhythm staggers, recovers, carries on. You smile. Endurance has its own choreography. Before you go, you glance at a small framed photograph on a side table. The Maharaja at Geneva had angled, coat neat, those familiar eyes narrowed against the lake light. He looks, in the picture, entirely well alert, amused, sure-footed, pictures like kindly. He will die in 1949, after seeing the world shift on its axis. Accounts differ on the final straw. Some say pneumonia, others point to a heart long tired of the parade, but the palaces remain, their plaster and marble, a record of a man who made a city into a love letter to France and who, in private, learned to keep his pulse between appointments. Wikipedia travels of Samwise step out into the garden where the peacocks have calmed and night jasmine sweetens the air. Beyond the hedges, a bicycle bell twinkles on the road, the ordinary life of Kapurthala slipping past the gates. Behind you, a valet dims lamps room by room. The last light goes out under a painted ceiling where Apollo forever brings the morning. And somewhere in the cooling dark, a clock that isn't sure of the hour chimes anyway, just in case. From Punjab's scented gardens, the air thins and sharpens. You're standing on the platform of a small Austrian station, steam curling around your legs. The train from Vienna slows to a halt, and stepping down onto the frosted boards is Empress Elizabeth of Austria, CC to the gossip sheets, a romantic enigma to her people. The newspapers show her as eternally slender, with hair like a dark waterfall to her knees, a figure gliding through ballrooms in clouds of silk. But here, close enough to hear her steadying breath in the cold, you see the cracks in the portrait. She moves slightly, yes, but her hand is on the arm of her lady-in-waiting. In the last few years, fainting spells have interrupted public appearances, and behind her legendary figure is a body often running on too little food and too much motion. Mainstream history records her relentless riding, hiking, fencing. Her obsession with maintaining a waistline so narrow she could span it with her hands. It also records the whispers that the Empress struggled with what we'd now call an eating disorder, punishing her body with extreme diets and compulsive exercise. You follow her to a sleigh waiting beyond the platform. Bells jingle as horses toss their heads, and she steps inside with a grace that hides the care it costs her. The cold pinks her cheeks, but the way she leans against the seat tells you she's measuring her strength. Historians still argue whether these fainting spells were from malnutrition, anemia, or some more elusive malady, but everyone agrees she planned her appearances like military campaigns, making sure the world saw her only at her brightest. Your quirky tidbit. Cece traveled with her own scale, an ornate contraption in polished brass and mahogany which she insisted on using daily, even in foreign palaces. There are accounts of porters carrying it into grand hotels before her luggage, as if it were a crown jewel. The sleigh glides through snow-dusted pines toward a hunting lodge. She talks lightly with her companions, but her eyes keep drifting toward the mountains. They say she preferred solitude to the stiff ceremonies of court, disappearing for weeks to walk in the countryside. Here, her illness found her anyway. You recall the letters where she complains of dizziness, weakness, the frustration of a body that could ride 50 miles one day and betray her the next. 3 small sparks of humor surface even in the frost. First, a stable boy desperately trying to brush a horse that clearly believes grooming is an attack. Second, a lady-in-waiting whose hat keeps catching low branches, leaving a trail of pine needles down her coat. And third, a stubborn squirrel that plants itself in the sleigh's path, forcing the driver to slow until it deigns to move. At the lodge, she retreats to a drawing room with tall windows and a fire snapping in the grate. A tea tray arrives, delicate porcelain, lemon slices, a plate of tiny biscuits. She eats none of them, instead sipping hot water and lemon, the way she prefers. Conversation drifts toward politics, Hungarian affairs, which she follows closely, but after half an hour she leans back, eyes closing. Her ladies exchange glances, quietly adjusting the cushions, drawing the curtains a little. Historians still debate how much of her life was shaped by this hidden fragility. Was it her health that kept her away from court, or her spirit resisting the suffocating etiquette of the Habsburg court? Perhaps both. Either way, her absence left a gap in Vienna's public life, one filled by portraits, poems, and rumors. As night gathers outside, she rises and walks to the window. The mountains are black silhouettes against a sky salted with stars. For a moment she looks almost transparent in the firelight, as if she could simply vanish into the glass. She touches the pane, exhales a long, slow breath, and you realize she's not just keeping herself apart from the court, she's holding herself together, day by day, with the same deliberate precision she applies to her public image. You leave her there, wrapped in lamplight and silence, knowing that some illnesses hide not in beds but in rituals, in the spaces between appearances, in the quiet refusal to be seen at anything less than one's most perfect angle. From the snowy Alps, the air thickens to the warm, honeyed stillness of a Spanish summer. You're in the Royal Hunting Lodge outside Madrid, cicadas buzzing like tiny castanets in the trees. The year is early in the 18th century, and Philip, the of Spain grandson of Louis XIV, sits slouched in a carved armchair, his uniform jacket half unbuttoned despite the presence of ministers. His eyelids droop mid-sentence. At first, you assume it's boredom. Then, without ceremony, his head falls forward and he's asleep. Narcolepsy, though unnamed at the time, is the thread running through his reign. Mainstream history paints Philip as a man prone to long periods of lethargy, retreating into bed for weeks or even months, leaving the government in the hands of his second wife, Elizabeth Farnese, and a close circle of ministers. His sleep attacks were sudden and unpredictable. He could nod off during a hunt, a mass, or a council meeting. You follow him later into a chapel. The priest begins the liturgy, and Philip's lips move in silent prayer. Halfway through, his head tilts, eyes closing. An aide discreetly clears his throat. Another shifts in place, ready to wake him if the silence stretches too long. Historians still argue whether this was truly narcolepsy, severe depression, or a mix of both. Some even suggest it was a coping mechanism, a retreat from a mind overwhelmed by the endless tangle of Bourbon politics. Here's your quirky tidbit. Philip was known to spend hours, sometimes entire nights, playing the guitar in bed, strumming softly while courtiers waited for him to resume affairs of state. It was both a private comfort and a subtle signal that official duties could wait until he felt ready. In the royal gardens, the scene is deceptively lively. Courtiers stroll in embroidered coats, fountains sparkle in the sun. You walk beside Philip as he chats amiably with an ambassador, but you see his steps slow, his eyes glaze. Within minutes, he is led to a shaded bench, where he dozes, while the ambassador quietly continues the conversation with Elizabeth Farnese instead. Three small bursts of humor surface here. First, a page boy who keeps nodding off himself while standing guard, as if the royal condition is contagious. Second, a haughty nobleman trying to wake the king by coughing politely, only to trip on the gravel in the process. And third, a gardener who carries on explaining his rose pruning technique to the sleeping monarch, seemingly unfazed that his audience is unconscious. Back inside, Philip reclines in a private chamber where the shutters are drawn against the afternoon glare. His doctor, a serious man in a powdered wig, takes his pulse and prescribes rest and gentle diversion, which is akin to advising rain to be wet. The queen sits nearby, reviewing petitions, occasionally glancing at her husband with an expression somewhere between fondness and exasperation. Historians still debate the extent to which Philip's condition hampered Spain's governance. Some argue Elizabeth's strong political will kept the kingdom's affairs running smoothly. Others believe decisions languished, delayed by a court forced to operate around the king's irregular wakefulness. As evening falls, you watch Philip rouse himself for a small dinner. Candles burn low, the air fragrant with roasted almonds and wine. He's alert for a while, even animated when speaking of music and hunting. But you see the signs: the slowing speech, the unfocused gaze. Soon, he excuses himself, the night not yet old but already claimed by sleep. You leave the lodge under a sky spangled with stars, the hum of cicadas softening. Behind you, in the quiet chambers, the King of Spain sleeps once more his reign, measured not just in treaties and battles, but in the unpredictable rhythm of eyes that close without warning. From the warm hum of a Spanish night, the air cools into a brisk, sea-scented wind off the Risund. You stand on the gravel path of a Danish palace garden in the late 19th century. The clipped hedges and flower beds are flawless, but you notice one thing missing: mirrors. Inside the palace, the same absence. You can walk through drawing rooms, guest chambers, even dressing closets, and never catch your reflection. This is the world of Princess Alexandra of Denmark, later Queen Alexandra of the United Kingdom, who, after a childhood bout with rheumatic fever, left her with a slight facial scar and a permanent limp, quietly removed or avoided mirrors whenever she could. Mainstream history remembers Alexandra as the fashionable, warm-hearted consort of Edward VII, adored for her charm and charitable works. She set trends that rippled through the British Empire: pearls worn high on the neck, chokers to draw the eye away from the scar, dresses cut to hide a limp. She moved with grace, but every step was calculated, every angle rehearsed. The limp itself became part of her allure, a royal gait imitated by some society ladies, though few knew it came from an illness at age 18 that left its mark for life. You follow her through a sunlit corridor hung with portraits. The frames are gilt, the faces are idealized. She glances up at them without lingering, as if looking too closely might invite unwanted comparisons. Historians still argue whether her aversion to mirrors was pure vanity or a deeper symptom of self-consciousness, a subtle, chronic discomfort with how illness had shaped her image. Your quirky tidbit: Alexandra became so skilled at avoiding mirrors that when traveling abroad, she would have servants rearrange hotel furniture so no reflective surfaces faced her bed or dressing table. There's a persistent, half-amused story of her covering a gilt pier glass with a tablecloth moments before the arrival of a visiting dignitary, simply because she didn't want to risk catching sight of herself unexpectedly. She stops in a music room where the light is softer, filtering through lace curtains. Her limp is almost imperceptible here on the thick carpet. A lady in waiting brings tea. Alexandra thanks her and settles on a settee, smoothing her skirts over her knees. She speaks of her charities with a bright voice, but her hands stay busy folding the napkin edge, adjusting her bracelet as though stillness invites the wrong kind of attention. Your three glimmers of humor come tucked in these domestic rhythms. First, a Pekingese dog that hops onto the settee uninvited, planting itself like a royal advisor. Second, a footman who, in his zeal to serve tea, nearly pours it into a flower vase before recovering with a bow. And third, a parrot in the corner that mimics the household bell so perfectly that it sends a maid hurrying in and then fleeing. In embarrassment in private conversation, Alexandra admits she dreads the harsh light of photographers' studios. She prefers outdoor sittings, where sunlight blurs the details and a breeze can be blamed for any uneveness. When she must sit for formal portraits, she chooses profile poses that flatter her features, her gaze turned towards some invisible horizon. The artists oblige, the public sees only poise. Historians still debate how much her self-image influenced her role as queen. Some suggest her elegance and composure became a kind of armor, allowing her to control how she was seen despite the changes illness brought. Others think it was less about control and more about retreat, a quiet act of self-protection in a world where every royal detail was public property. As the afternoon wanes, Alexandra rises and walks into the garden. She pauses near a marble fountain, leaning slightly on her cane. The breeze ruffles her veil. The light is kind, breaking on the water in soft flashes. You see her tilt her head, catching her reflection there for a fleeting moment before turning away. It's deliberate, almost ritual, acknowledging the image, then releasing it. You leave her in the garden, her figure framed by the roses she planted herself, moving slowly but with the dignity of someone who has decided that grace is not the absence of imperfection, but the way you carry it. The sea breeze of Denmark still lingers in your hair when the air thickens, heavy with the scent of rain on stone. You're in Vienna, but not the glittering Vienna of Strauss waltzes. This is Schönbrunn Palace in the early 20th century. Its yellow facade softened under an autumn drizzle. Inside, the corridors are quieter than they should be for the seat of an empire. The hush follows you into a private chamber where Emperor Franz Joseph I, old and shrunken in his uniform, sits by a window. His hand rests on the arm of the chair, fingers tapping faintly a slow metronome keeping time with breaths that come. Shallow, labored. Mainstream history remembers Franz Joseph for his near 7-decade reign, the embodiment of the Austro-Hungarian monarchy's endurance through wars, assassinations, and political upheaval. But by the end of his life in 1916, pneumonia had taken root in his lungs. For a man who had weathered personal tragedy, the suicide of his son, the assassination of his wife Elizabeth, the execution of his brother Maximilian, the illness seemed almost an afterthought in the public eye. Yet here, in this room, it is the only opponent left to fight. The emperor's days have narrowed into a careful routine. Ministers visit in short bursts. Papers are signed in the morning when his strength is better. Historians still argue whether his final decisions, especially in the first years of the Great War, were shaped by fatigue and illness, or whether his policy would have been the same had his lungs been sound. What's certain is that every breath now costs him something, and the empire pays in his stead. Your quirky tidbit: Franz Joseph was notorious for his punctuality, rising at 3:30 a.m. every day for most of his life. Even with pneumonia, he insisted on being woken before dawn, telling aides, "An emperor cannot oversleep." This, despite the fact that his doctors begged him to rest longer, citing the chill of those early hours as a risk. You follow him into a small study lined with maps and photographs. He leans over a dispatch from the front, eyes scanning but not lingering. His mind is quick, but his body insists on pauses. When a coughing fit grips him, an attendant silently sets down a glass of warm milk sweetened with honey. Franz Joseph takes it without comment, sipping slowly until the spasm passes. Even here, moments of lightness flicker. First, a young aide tripping over the emperor's ever-present hunting boots left by the door. Second, an old pointer dog wandering in and resting its head on his lap, unbothered by protocol. And third, the emperor himself chuckling quietly when an inkwell lid snaps shut like a pistol, startling a too-serious secretary. In the afternoon, he walks slowly along the gallery that overlooks the gardens. The chestnut trees are nearly bare, their leaves slick with rain. He pauses often, resting a hand on the balustrade, looking out as if memorizing the scene. Beyond the gardens, the city is gray, war-worn, and waiting. Historians still debate whether he understood, in these final months, how near the end of both his life and his empire lay. Some accounts suggest he believed the monarchy would endure past him. Others hint that he knew it would dissolve in the storm already gathering at its borders. Perhaps both were true belief for the court, doubt for himself. As evening settles, he returns to his chair by the window. The rain has stopped, the air smells clean, almost sweet. He closes his eyes for a long moment, and you sense he's listening not to ministers or clocks, but to the quiet of a city that has been his stage for nearly 70 years. The room dims as lamps are lit. Outside, the first stars prick the sky. The emperor's breathing is even, but you can hear the effort in it, like a distant tide pulling against the shore. You realize that this is how empires end, sometimes not with a sudden collapse, but with the steady, measured breaths of a ruler watching the light fade, holding on until there's nothing left to hold. And now, with the candlelight softening against the walls and the night settling over every place we've been from Versailles to Vienna, you feel the journey ease into stillness. The royals we've walked beside are no longer towering figures of portraits and statues. They're people whose crowns weighed heavier because of the bodies that bore them. Each illness, each small hidden battle, blurred the line between the public face and the private cost. The palaces are quiet now. Gardens rest under frost or moonlight. The corridors hold only the memory of footsteps, some slow with pain, some shuffled in exhaustion, some careful not to wake the sleeper on the throne. And in that quiet, you see how even the grandest lives are measured in heartbeats, in breaths, in the fragile machinery of the human frame. Outside, the air has cooled. A faint wind carries the scent of rain and turned earth. Somewhere, far away, a clock chimes, not urgent, just marking time the way it always has. You picture each figure we've met tonight in their own stillness. Louis adjusting his robe to hide a wince, George gazing at a garden only he could name in Latin, Victoria stirring tea she never drinks, Alexei clutching his spaniel for warmth. Alexandra stepping carefully past a mirrorless wall. Let the images fade slowly, like candle flames bending lower. Let the voices soften to a hum you can't quite catch. And as your breathing matches the rhythm of that imagined quiet, the palaces close their doors, the lights dim, and history folds itself into the kind of peace that belongs only to the night. Sleep well.